Hello, bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another session of the CSPC virtual series. This time we have a panel titled Building National Networks to Solve Wicked Problems. This is based on the project that formed and named as CanCOVID. When the pandemic erupted in March and April, I think the group of individuals from different institutions got together and started this project. This panel is about this project, and we would like to know more about this in terms of the academic institutions across Canada got together to link with the policymakers on this particular issue and beyond. We would like to hear from them. Also, as you know, this panel was supposed to be held last week on Wednesday, June the 10th, but in solidarity with Black Lives Matters and the day that was announced with many academic institutions across North America to change their schedule in solidarity with the movement and to focus on how they increase and combat the systemic racism across institutions. And we did it at CSPC, and we hope to continue that conversation and hear from all of you on this matter. So going back to the panel, this panel is moderated by Dr. Sarah Gallagher, Science Advisor to the President of Canadian Space Agency. Sarah has a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics from Penn State, which was supported by NASA graduate student fellowships. Dr. Gallagher has researched and used to be a researcher in Western University and focuses on studying growing supermassive black holes at the centers, distant galaxies, and the interactions between galaxies in crowded environment. I'm not understanding too much of it, but it sounds very interesting, I must tell you. And so she has over 100 referred papers, and that includes data from 10 different space observatories. And she has been recognized with an Ontario Early Career Researcher Award and a Western University Faculty Scholar Award. She regularly speaks to the public in various issues of the space and also has been speaker many times at the CSPC. At this point, I want to leave it to you, Sarah, to introduce the panelists and lead the discussion. And with your permission, I hide myself from the screen.
Thank you so much, Mehrdad. We are delighted to be here, and it is such a privilege to be able to share with you what we've been doing with CanCOVID. So I would like to introduce my panelists. So first panelist is Dr. Karen Dodds. She started as a research scientist in microbiology and subsequently moved to executive management roles with Environment Canada and Health Canada. She served on boards, including the Canada Health Infoway, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the WHO Executive Board. She's now serving as a consultant to the VP of Infectious Diseases for the Public Health Agency of Canada and is on CanCOVID's Governing Council. So thank you so much for being here, Karen. Our second panelist is Dr. Marcel Behrl, who's a clinician scientist and professor at McGill University. His research employs genomic methods to study the epidemiology and pathogenesis of tuberculosis and other mycobacterial infections. He's the interim director of McGill's Infectious Diseases Division and has published an extensive record of more than 200 peer-reviewed publications, reviews, and book chapters. Currently, he is the moderator of 2 diagnostics channels on CanCOVID. Thank you, Marcel. Dr. Ramy Saleh is the founder of AirMed Trials and a practicing physician in oncology at the McGill University Health Center. He's worked on clinical trials with the Research Institute of McGill University Health Center, the University of Toronto, and University Health Network, among others. He's currently used his expertise in health informatics and clinical trials to launch Covidtrials.ca, which he'll be talking about later today. So first, I want to let everybody know. And thank you, Ramy, for joining us. First, I'd like to let everybody know a little bit about what CanCOVID is. So first of all, it was set up to solve 3 specific problems: to connect researchers across Canada, to provide input from broader academic community to healthcare providers and decision makers as issues arise, and to rapidly respond to inquiries from decision-making sectors that can benefit from broad input. So that was the intention, was to solve those 3 problems. That are generated in the context of the pandemic that we're all dealing with. So we specifically wanted to expedite communication and collaboration between the scientific, healthcare, and policy communities during this COVID-19 crisis. This was an initiative that was launched extremely quickly. It was about a week from the original mandate from the Chief Science Advisor to a live website. And then further, we started onboarding moderators, including Marcel, very quickly by the end of March, with the official March on April 1. So within a few days, we had many active members. And currently, we have a speaker series, a Twitter account, and about 2,000 members. As an example of the interactions that happen on the platform, so it's a specific online platform for people to exchange information and ideas. There have been 20,000 messages sent since launch on April 1. We've collectively written briefing notes to the Public Health Agency of Canada, Health Canada, and other agencies, sourced information on mobile testing lab source resources for Nunavut, organized a call for modelers to advise the Ontario's new health data platform, and created a space for researchers to form new pan-Canadian teams with better representation of early career researchers and women of color. So we have titled this panel, Building National Networks to Solve Wicked Problems. And so first I want to talk about what a wicked problem is, because COVID-19 is certainly qualifies. So some characteristics of a wicked problem are that the problem is new, so solutions have not already been generated. It is complex and tangled, and the landscape of the problem can shift over time. And there's no clear right answer to solving this problem, and the stakeholders have different and even conflicting priorities and values. So now I want to turn the discussion over to our panelists and hear about some of their ideas and proposed solutions and reflections on the wicked problem of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So first, I'd like to start with Dr. Karen Dodds and ask you, Karen, what do you think makes COVID-19 a wicked problem?
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, first of all, obviously, this pandemic is being caused by a disease agent we haven't seen before, and it's causing a disease that we haven't seen before. So it is brand new. We certainly have learned before from SARS and H1 some aspects of handling these kinds of issues, and there are similarities, but actually the differences are just as important here as the similarities. And sometimes one of the issues in this kind of thing is knowing what assumptions you've made and all the time kind of checking, is that assumption continuing to be an appropriate assumption, or is it time to change my assumption? It's also a wicked problem just because the degree of public health impact is absolutely, well, unprecedented in our times for sure. So when you think of what work the Public Health Agency typically does and its remit, and then think of the fact that it needs to be talking to people at the Canadian Border Services about border shutdowns, Transport Canada about air travel, with the provinces and territories who have primary responsibility for public health services in the provinces. It's tangled. It's going everywhere in society, in economy. It's not staying just at a public health issue. Obviously, the kind of impacts from the disease, but from the steps that have been taken to control the disease are impacts that are going to be with us in a variety of ways. There's interest in how this is going to impact childhood development. How does it impact the debt level of the country? How does it impact our public health capacity going forward? So it's clearly a wicked problem, impacting us in a number of different ways.
Thank you, Karen. That was an excellent excellent summary. I also wanted to mention to everybody that we're going to be having our discussion for about the first 30 minutes or so, and then we will be opening up the panel to questions. So please use the Q&A button on your Zoom in order to ask questions of the panelists. So just to follow up on that, on what you've said so far, you've been in government for quite a while. You have a lot of experience in different departments. What do you see specifically about this pandemic that has affected the activity of government and policymakers, both in positive and negative ways?
Sure. If we think about a typical crisis event, the normal routine is turn to a command and control kind of approach. But when you contrast a command and control approach with the breadth of the impact of COVID-19, you can see it's going to really put stressors on different sectors. So for policymakers, again, as a federal public servant, folks know that Cabinet, the Prime Minister created a special committee of Cabinet devoted to COVID-19. That means that the whole public service is sort of prepped to prepare information for them that they can base decisions on. Again, I did not think in my time as a public service, I would have ministers familiar with what PCR meant. You know, ministers, many of them now understand PCR. They understand the difference clearly between DNA and RNA. It's been a challenge in terms of communicating. It's been a challenge in terms of coordinating. It's clearly been a challenge in terms of having the kind of evidence and information needed to support decision-making at hand. And that is one of the reasons why I'm very, very supportive of CanCOVID. When you look up and you say, well, who are the experts in Canada on COVID-19 or the viral agent that caused it? Well, there are none because it's brand new. And so we have to link out to so many different sources of information and try and pull it all in. But at the same time, we have to work through some of the traditional decision-making processes that have been established. As I said, in Canada, it's the provinces that have primary responsibility for both healthcare and public health. The federal level doesn't actually have a lot of direct authority there. And so we need to sit and work very closely with provincial and territorial colleagues, which we do, and the Public Health Agency does on a routine basis. But again, each province and territory is having their own unique experience with COVID-19. So it took a while for it to be really understood, okay, urban centers are going to be really problematic. Ontario and Quebec are going to have a tougher time of it than some of the smaller provinces. And luckily, in comparison to H1N1, which hit some of the remote and Indigenous communities very hard, we're for the most part, the remote and rural areas of Canada are not having the same impact. So there's a desire to have common communications and common policy when you've got a background of very different experiences in very different areas.
Thank you, Karen. That's really helpful to get an idea of what the policy landscape is and also some of the structural issues with actually organizing a response and ingesting lots and lots of information. There's basically been a call to become scientifically literate, essentially immediately, by a lot of public officials who weren't really required to do that before. So now I want to sort of focus in on a specific area where this issue has perhaps been highlighted and turn to our expert on diagnostics, Dr. Marcel Behrl. So first, Marcel, could you please just describe briefly why diagnostics are so important in this crisis and what that really means? What do diagnostics mean?
Sorry about that. I had to unmute. I'm learning how to unmute as I go through this Zoom live. So thanks. So diagnostics works in sort of two spheres for COVID. As doctors, we want to know why an individual is sick. And as epidemiologists, we want to know who is spreading the virus. And because of that, diagnostics happens in two spaces, largely in a kind of hospital labs and also places that we call reference labs or provincial labs. Karen just mentioned that politicians have only recently learned what PCR is. Politicians are only learning the difference between DNA and RNA. And I bet you they're also learning where these reference labs are that they didn't really know much about and are providing the kind of the cornerstone information on how many people are actively shedding the virus today and where are the people who are actively shedding the virus today so we can identify their contacts and make sure their contacts do not spread it to other people. So basically diagnostics gives us some sort of a number of who has confirmed COVID-19, by the detection of the virus SARS-CoV-2 and allows us to determine and to track it and to follow the spread, and through certain very high-tech techniques like sequencing the entire virus to even trace it back. Recently, it was shown in the UK that over 1,000 people brought SARS-CoV-2 from Spain, France, and Italy back into England. There was no patient zero that you could have just boxed into one room. There were thousands of people returning from their holidays, and that created a wave of transmission. And we have to have the capacity to know what happened in our first wave and to be ready in September, October, once we open up schools, to see where the virus is transmitting so we can shut it down as soon as possible.
Thank you, Marcel. So can you talk a little bit about how the landscape of the diagnostics has changed over the past 3 months, and what the initial setup was and decisions that were made and what those impacts were?
Sure. So at first we had a very limited menu of testing. You had to get a nose swab and send it to a reference lab, and the reference labs were the only places that were set up and gave quality testing. And that was great because if you got it to that lab, you got a result you could count on. Unfortunately, as there was the surge of cases, we were overwhelming the labs, and there was the issue of transport. You have to ask yourself, is it better to bring a swab from Iqaluit to Ottawa, or is it better to bring a small machine from Ottawa to Iqaluit? So over time, landscape of diagnostics has changed by decentralizing testing, putting more and more testing capacity in frontline hospitals and into regional labs, having smaller, more portable, more flexible instruments as a first step, and that's just looking for a virus. And then also in that same time frame, diagnostic testing has gone from not merely looking for the virus, but also looking for an immune response to the virus, as we now have several companies that have put out what are called serology tests, where we can take a blood sample and ask, were you infected 1, 2, or 3 months, or at some point in the past? And the serology surveys allow us to determine what % of people in Switzerland are seropositive, or what % of healthcare workers in London, England are seropositive. So it's not telling you in real time what's going on, but it's allowing you in retrospect to get an assessment of what is the level of immunity in a population.
Thank you. And just in terms of thinking about sort of looking forward to the next couple months, what is the role of diagnostics in terms of doing things like opening the economy and restarting schools?
Well, I think the good news is that after we had this huge wave and we all learned a lot, and we learned how to wear our PPE correctly, we learned how to get samples correctly, we got our labs up and running, and all our procedures are in place, we are going to be much more responsive going forward. So what's going to happen is we're going to open up, and occasionally there will be a school outbreak. And then we're going to say, is that school outbreak going to swarm into the community and into the senior residences, or will we be able to contain it among children who are in the same school? And I think diagnostics is going to be essential for promptly responding and determining the extent of spread, so that we do have the capacity to open up our restaurants. We do have the capacity to open up the washrooms in our restaurants and other things. Otherwise, we're all going to be kind of boxed into our home bubbles for the foreseeable future. And certain parts of the province or the country are moving towards opening. So we have to be ready to detect a single case and react to it.
Thank you, Marcel. So now I'd like to turn to our third panelist, Dr. Ramy Saleh, who is an expert in clinical trials. So Ramy, could you first start and tell us what is the role of clinical trials in responding to a pandemic? Why is this something we should be thinking about?
So I think, as everybody knows, there is no standard of care treatment against COVID-19. And the only way to try to understand what treatment is ideal or works, and in addition to that, which vaccine actually works, we need to test it through the clinical trials, our usual channels. So clinical trials are the most important factor in order to proceed in discovering a standard of care treatment against COVID-19 in order to get out of our bubble and back to how life used to be before.
Thank you. And you gave a seminar for the CanCOVID members, And you talked about why clinical trials, that landscape is particularly challenging. Could you basically flesh out for our listeners what is challenging about a clinical trial? Why is it so hard?
Absolutely. I think over the last 3 months, the issue with this is a rapidly evolving disease. And instead of us being ready towards it, we are learning as we go. So time is against us in one way, but also the foundations that we have in hospitals for clinical trials have been proved to be somewhat fragile when COVID-19 hit. Meaning all the doctors went hands on deck 3 months ago in order to treat patients, and by not allowing coordinators to come into work, all the clinical trial centers were shutting off. It proved to be challenging to open clinical trials that easily. There have been some changes that were done. For example, the research ethic boards of hospitals focus only on clinical trials against COVID-19. The other challenge that showed is satellite hospitals. So other than big universities were accustomed to opening trials fast, the smaller hospitals showed to be somewhat slower and required more help and more directions into how to open clinical trials in their hospitals. The other challenge is that for the first time, we have a disease where you want to conduct a clinical trial. However, you want to avoid the patient from actually being seen or bringing the patient to the hospital in order to avoid any contamination. So the reliance was heavily on social media as well as online platforms and online technologies. And as I said in the presentation that I did, is we are still in the Stone Age in terms of health informatics in the medical world. And this proved to be quite challenging over the last 3 to 4 months.
So could you talk a little bit about the specific solution that you and your team have come up with in terms of how to actually launch effective clinical trial program within Canada?
Absolutely. So the idea came through the CanCOVID channels. I predicted that not only me, as well as some other colleagues in the CanCOVID channels, that we will have to rely very quickly on online platforms in order to raise awareness. And this time, it's going to be harder for us to engage Canadians in order to understand the importance of clinical trials. As Marcel said, the politicians were having problems and still having problems in understanding the medical jargon, but also the Canadian population needed a little bit more encouragement to understand the importance of clinical trials as well as volunteering. So the initiative that we did, the Covidtrials.ca, is the first online portal that shows all Canadians what clinical trials are being conducted in their provinces or in their cities. You can have a quick, easy look in very simple terms. In addition to that, it encourages them to participate. It's a platform that was not done anywhere in the world before in terms of its complexity as well as its safety. We know now that the Americans are developing one of their own, so we're happy that we're the first in the world to actually think about this.
Well, congratulations. That's fantastic.
Thanks.
I just want to remind everybody that if you have a question, to please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat. So we're looking for the Q&A. So now I would like to turn back to my panelists, and I have a question that I'd like to open up to all three of you. So the CanCOVID in many ways is an experiment. It's something that hadn't been done on this scale before in Canada, to try to create a platform to bring together a diverse group of people in order to have transdisciplinary expertise in one location so people could share information and try to learn from each other. So I'd be interested to hear from each of you about what you think the most promising result is that you've seen that come out of this platform. And next I will ask you if you have any issues, any things that are not working. So Marcel, I'd like to start with you. So if you could go ahead and let us know of any results from CanCOVID that you found promising so far.
Well, sure. So what was interesting to me is we started off with a question about just diagnostics. And I said, well, how do you diagnose it? You either look for the virus or you look for an immune response. So we created 2 channels. And already the serology channel looking for immunity has 70 members. The viral detection has 209 members. So that was a good start. But from the viral detection, a bunch of people said, we want to look for virus in wastewater. Some call it sewage treatment. And an entire new channel spawned. And from that, research teams and grant opportunities and really efforts that I've even heard of back here at McGill, people I've never met before are now looking at detecting virus in wastewater as an early sentinel that there's ongoing transmission in the community, and looking for whether there's strains that are somewhat different from what they're seeing in the hospital. So that's probably been the biggest success. So you start off with a very defined channel and you create a brand new channel, and that channel just took off with the idea and created its own new research community.
Thank you for that example. So Ramy, do you have, do you have any examples that you could share?
Absolutely. I think 3 months ago, when we started thinking about clinical trials, there was a lot of hesitation on how to open trials and how to collaborate. I think the Slack channel for clinical trials proved to be efficient, where not only there was a lot of members, but there was also, I would say, a unique collaboration where we were spinning ideas off of each other, but also collaborating in order to open multiple trials through different sites very quickly. So I think this proved to be quite beneficial, that communication and coordination can be actually done fast and swift and efficient.
Thank you. So Karen, if you could put your policy hat on and think about what is your sort of ideal outcome? What is the thing that you feel like from a policy point of view would be extremely useful that this type of a platform could enable?
I think there's two aspects, and one is the reach. So again, if I think of the Public Health Agency, Health Canada, other departments that have their own internal science capacity, they have their typical colleagues that they'll work with in the academic sector or in the healthcare sector. But the reach of CanCOVID, the reach of those 2,000 active folks far exceeds what we would have had in, I'll call it in peacetime kind of operations. And there are different sources. Again, I think when you are in front of a novel challenge, you need some novel ideas. And clearly through the two examples that Marcel and Ramy have shared with us, we're seeing novel ideas come forward, and we're quickly seeing the ability for those novel ideas to get up to a level that actually has an impact on decisions. It really helps speed things up, which in this case is needed, but it will also, I think, help build a more nimble, flexible sort of ecosystem in Canada going forward, which I think is great.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to switch over to the chat now, to the Q&A, excuse me. We've got lots of great questions coming in, and so I want to give people, our panelists, an opportunity to weigh in on this. So here's a question from Diane Finegood. It feels like CanCOVID is really promoting a culture shift in science towards collaboration across expertise, groups, and principal investigators. How can we sustain this paradigm shift given that connectivity is essential for wicked problems? So I will toss that out to our panelists. If you would like to take it, please raise your hand. Go ahead, Karen. Thank you.
So hi to Diane. I think it's a really good point she's made. If you think of, as I sort of talked about, the science ecosystem in Canada, and at the federal level, you've got the three major granting councils, CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC. They each deal with their typical community, and this is certainly showing us an issue that needs expertise across all three. And I'm not one to be able to comment on how much the NSERC community is unique and different from the CIHR community. I know there are reasons for that, but we need to be able to move not just from one area to another, but across all areas. And I think CanCOVID has shown that that's possible.
Thank you, Karen. So I'd like to tweak that question a little bit and ask Ramy, do you think that when you were starting up your COVID trials initiative, was that sort of outside of the scope of your normal incentives, or was it aligned with them so it made perfect sense in terms of your normal research activity?
I think it was a little bit out of my expertise. This is why we required a lot of help from different people in the medical leadership. the good thing that came out of it, and I would like to touch on the question by the anonymous person about how we can collaborate also, just to interlink it together, is we try doing something that's unique, just as a proof of concept. So mind you, Covidtrials.ca is just a proof of concept, just like CanCOVID is, and proving to be interesting and able to grow. However, we should be careful also about the knowledge and the information that we have right now in order to make sure that this data is very well protected in this day and age too.
Thanks, Ramy. And Marcel, did you have anything to add on the topic?
I'm okay for now. I see another question that's going to be hitting me soon.
Okay, so why don't we go to that one? So the accuracy of the diagnostic tests have been problematic. Many options exist, for example, a nasopharyngeal, throat, etc., and none of the tests has 100% accuracy. The timing of the test also matters. Even when people have classical presentations for COVID-19, their test can be negative. The same concerns have been observed for serology testing. So what does the future hold for improving diagnostics?
So I would, in large terms, big buckets, I would say the reasons the tests are imperfect are either biologic or technical. And early on, we have more technical problems because labs are still trying to understand the positive controls and the negative controls and the analytic sensitivity, the capacity to do things. And with time, you have more companies, more labs and more government oversight. The technical problems should generally go away. And if you're going to make mistakes one way or the other, it's the biologic. But because the technique works, we're going to learn more about the biologic limitations. So the biologic limitations are, it's harder to find 10 to the 3 viruses, and it's easier to find 10 to the 9. That's just a simple fact. The people who shed more virus are going to be positive on most tests. The ones who shed very little virus might be missed. But then you can actually try to put in context how the diagnostics are changing while the rest of us are changing. So you may have a false negative test, but if you were wearing a mask and your healthcare provider was wearing a mask, then overall we're in a relatively safe situation. If you had 10 to the 9 virus, we're going to pick you up, and people are wearing masks and are maintaining distance. So the risk of missing something in June 20 is much less than the risk of missing something on February 20 when we weren't prepared and we didn't have all the other safeguards in place. Now, we're also learning when the tests become positive, 2 days before symptomatic, and when does the serology become positive. So as we have better and better assays, we're learning how to apply them the best. And if you take a good assay and you apply it to the wrong person, you will get a false negative or a false positive. So we're also going to just have better practice. It's what you call diagnostic stewardship, using the test in the most appropriate time and not wasting tests unnecessarily.
Thank you, Marcel. So I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to talk, so the top voted question right now, and I think this is perhaps a question for Karen, is what policy innovations have you seen arise during this time that would not be possible before? However, either Marcel or Ramy could also take it if we talk about policy as regards granting agencies and that sort of thing. So Karen, why don't you take a stab at that one first?
And that's challenging because there are policy innovations that have sort of already been put into place at even the highest level. If you think of sort of the virtual parliament and the ability for parliamentarians to contribute from where they are, that never ever would have been something considered possible, I'd say, before COVID-19. And now we'll have implications on how people are represented in Canada going forward, all the way down to the critical issue that certainly both Marcel and Ramy raised about data and the need to have data and the need to have good databases, good information flow, and understanding of what kind of data you are collecting. So one of the first things that I had seen from CanCOVID was that policy briefing note of we need to have better information when there is, when someone dies on their death certificate concerning things like ethnicity, et cetera. because without that, we can't tell, is COVID-19 having a disparate impact on different populations? And so I am seeing at the highest levels, both politically and in the public service, these kinds of issues are being addressed, and they're being addressed in ways they weren't before.
Thank you, Karen. Ramy?
I think not policy innovations, but flexibility more from the government or from Health Canada, for example. We're seeing them to be not lenient, but more open to, include more people in the clinical trials field, for example, where now nurse practitioners can lead clinical trials. We see that online platforms are being accepted. Before it was really not very much liked. And I think that slowly but surely the healthcare system is more and more being opened up to include more advanced technologies in order to implement during COVID-19.
Yeah, and I'd like to follow up with that. Just this meeting here is we're all in our offices and we're doing it from distance. And before, an ethics review, you wouldn't be able to zoom in. It would be considered, to be impolite to say I'm not going to show up. And you had to have wet signatures on consent forms. You were never allowed to have e-signatures. And I think we're starting to rethink these things and ask, why did we compel ourselves to be so restricted when now in COVID, we realize we are more flexible and we have ways to communicate information?
Thank you all. So we have another question that actually I'm going to take on. So it's, are there any initiatives currently in progress to construct a curriculum toolkit to standardize a level of scientific literacy and knowledge for policy leaders? And the answer to that is yes. There's at least two that I'm aware of. So Covid-19 Resources.ca is another initiative that was a grassroots initiative by scientists in Canada to gather together a lot of expertise in one place. And one of the things that they're talking about is putting together exactly that sort of toolkit. And similarly, CanCOVID, we've also are in the process of doing something similar as well to share the up-to-date scientific knowledge that really will underpin policy decisions, for example, on reopening. And so that's something that is in progress. I would say one of the biggest challenges of this is that the landscape of the research is changing. There are new papers that are being posted every single day that can tweak the understanding of the virus and how it transmits and all sorts of different aspects to it and the progression of disease. And so it's the sort of thing that they become outdated very, very quickly. But there is some initiative to share that scientific knowledge as soon as possible. So now I'm going to go to the next question, which I think is right in Ramy's wheelhouse. So clinical trials are expensive in Canada. In the UK, the NIHR has funded a network of sites with an interest in health outcomes research, including clinical trials who are poised, well-trained, and prepared to start a study rapidly. So, and the NIH uses the network of networks model. So for Dr. Saleh, what do you think Canada should do?
That's an excellent question. I think there's a lot of room to improve in the clinical trial sphere. As Marcel said, before we really needed the signature on informed consents. Right now, electronic signatures are accepted. The way I envision the future should be is divided into one. The more we rely on online technologies and online platforms that have been validated and safe in Canada, our costs will run down because you will not need that much of coordinators and study personnel to conduct the trials. So our costs will be low. The second thing that we are suffering with right now, and we say we wish we had it, is probably provincial REBs with more flexibility. Instead of submitting the same trial multiple times over in multiple hospitals in multiple provinces, if we have just one provincial or possibly one national one, that I would be dreaming. But if we have that, it will solve a lot of issues and become quite fast. Those are the two biggest bottlenecks, but I think they can be solved quite quickly, given that over the last 3 months, there has been initiative, or I would say tolerance, to accept these kinds of initiatives.
Thank you, Ramy. So if anybody's listening from the provinces or from the federal government, that's a wish list from Ramy, is to have some coordination so you don't have to submit the same paperwork 75 different times.
I also have to say one thing
Go
though.
ahead.
The most dangerous thing also is to allow researchers by themselves to create online tools without really understanding the security measures. I'm very adamant about that. Some people think that a monkey survey is safe or a Google Sheet is safe to conduct clinical trials. However, this is a big no-no. What we need is always a PIPEDA-approved platform. Canada has very stringent rules about that on how to share information. One of my hesitations is that people might tend to do mistakes even, without being conscious about it. And I think this is where we have to be careful, given, we need to gain the trust of the Canadian authorities that we will be able to do this swiftly and safely.
Thank you, Ramy. So here's a question both for Dr. Behrl and Dr. Dodds. So currently the interest in wastewater-based epidemiology is on the rise. What can the federal and provincial governments do to support the ability of wastewater-based epidemiology research to be better coordinated and best inform public health decision-making? So Karen, why don't you start with that one?
Oh boy. So I know this is an area that has really interesting potential for COVID-19. I don't know that it is what I would sort of call a proven technology yet. And I almost like the clinical trials aspect that you put to Remy. I would also be interested in what does the community think is appropriate ways of putting into place coordination. Rather than have somebody who's been in the federal government say, this is what I think is appropriate, what works for you. And again, one of the challenges that Canada has is how different the different parts of Canada are. So again, because of my background, I know a lot about wastewater treatment. And you go, Toronto, I think has 4 plants, Montreal has 1, but there's something like 1,800 across Canada. So it's a very different kind of situation that you're dealing with. And that is part of the challenge that is Canada, is we are a very diverse context.
Yeah, Marcel?
Yeah, well, I agree it's very diverse, and that's also perhaps what makes it a great opportunity. And not only for COVID, I think if a community of investigators comes together doing wastewater research and they develop the tools, they develop the common practices, and they have the pipelines of investigation, they also have the capacity to monitor things like antimicrobial resistance in the wastewater as well, and to start to pursue One Health investigations to look at whether there's spillover of animal pathogens into human sewage and vice versa. So I think right now it's an unproven technology with a lot of promise, but hopefully it's something that has promise to go beyond COVID and to spill over into other parts of infectious disease epidemiology in the country.
Thank you. So we have one more question currently on the Q&A. So I'm going to save that a little bit. It's a forward-looking question because I have some backward-looking questions. So I'd like to ask Karen and Marcel and Ramy to each comment on looking back 3 months and thinking about decisions that were made either for CanCOVID or other decisions that with hindsight being 2020 that you would alter based on what we know now. So Marcel, would you mind starting with that one?
Yeah, well, obviously we all have hindsight and we all wonder what should or shouldn't have been done. I think one of the things that I've wondered about a lot is when, at least in Quebec, when things came shutting down in early March, a lot of people came into work and had been overseas for, until 2-3 days before that, and they were told they didn't have to go in quarantine. And I think one of the things we should probably recognize is that if you've been traveling and you may have COVID, you should probably stay away for 14 days, no matter where, no matter when, and you can't be expecting that the recurrence will come from China or the recurrence will be coming from Iran. It really surprised us how the virus got around, and I think we have to be super vigilant and not make any assumptions about what to expect going forward. Aside from that, in CanCOVID, Was there anything else I would have done differently? It's hard to know. It's been very interesting to hear how communities have formed and communities have gone and created conversations. So I think it's been a great opportunity, and I guess, you know, it'll just be interesting to see where this leads to going forward, if it will have some sort of sustained legs even beyond COVID.
Thank you. Ramy, do you have comments on that? What would you have done differently with hindsight, looking back on the past 3 months?
I think, to be fair, there was a big governmental response against COVID-19. My wish would have been if they, you know, nominated the chief scientific officer to handle some stuff, as well as other different departments in the government. I would have hoped if they would have done a clinical trial board that oversees all the clinical trials in order to run them faster, ensure there's no competition among them, seek where there is help in order to open the trials faster. So the recruitment would be better. Right now, we're suffering in recruitment because some of the trials opened late. And my fear is, out of the 43 clinical trials that are open in Canada, probably more than 60% will not meet their recruitment rates. And that is unfortunate, because this is money that was funded by the government for those trials that will truly go nowhere.
So in this context, I'd just like you to clarify. So you're basically saying that without the coordination behind the input of research money, it's hard to basically have effective trials because there wasn't that underlying coordination?
I think the Canadian government's first effort, and this is the right way to go, is to provide money to researchers to encourage clinical trials. However, you can put a lot of money in opening clinical trials, and you can open hundreds of them, but that does not mean that you will reach your recruitment rate if you don't have, you know, a unified stream or a standard stream on how to conduct the trials. For example, we have one in Montreal that's aiming for 6,000 patients, and currently, as Marcel alluded to before, we have less than 100 cases a day. Probably out of those, 5 might be eligible to the trial. So if we just do simple math, this trial will close in 1 year. And we do know that might not last that much, and the funding will go dry. So yes, I do believe when you fund clinical trials, you have to ensure that you have a proper networking and a proper streamline on how to conduct and open them.
And Karen, do you have something to weigh in on looking back in the past 3 months? What do you think could have been done differently?
I'm going to come back to Marcel's comment about assumptions. Assumptions are needed, but you need to be clear on what your assumptions are and what you're basing them on. And I think from the get-go, if everyone who was speaking in some sort of knowledgeable sense about this was clear about what was fact and what was an assumption. If I think right back to sort of the basis, Canada's pandemic preparedness plan is based on an assumption that the pandemic would be influenza. This is not influenza, this is different. The pandemic preparedness plan still provides lots of good guidance, but there is that very significant difference. It's not influenza. Previous experience with SARS and H1N1 had shown that trying to restrict travel was actually not very helpful. Well, guess what? In this one, it would have turned out to have been really significantly impactful if some of the international travel was stopped earlier. Again, it was an assumption based on good evidence from H1 and SARS, but everybody who's making decisions based on assumptions always needs to be ready to change their assumption when the evidence tells them it's time to change. And we will continue to be in that state as we see the overall epidemic curve right now in Canada going down nicely, but we have a lot of certainty that there will be some blips, and how Canadians respond to those blips will depend so much, not just on what is said at the time, but how we've preconditioned them now to respond to things. So again, there was a question about building scientific literacy amongst sort of political people, but there is also the issue of building scientific literacy in Canadians writ large and in the media too.
Thank you. So I think we're in a good position to maybe consider our final question that's on the question board. So the question is, what will CanCOVID look like in 1 year or 2 years, 5 years? So this is currently something that was created in response to an immediate crisis. The crisis is evolving, but it will not last forever. And does something like CanCOVID have longevity beyond the current crisis? So Marcel, are you willing to start this off?
Sure. So I guess there's two broad possibilities. Either we successfully eliminate COVID and therefore we eliminate CanCOVID, and it'll be kind of like the smallpox team, and that will be wonderful. Or we say, wait a minute, we can control COVID, but we shouldn't disband CanCOVID, because the initiative and the team and the collaboration and the spirit and some of the things we've learned about it should carry on and could inform the next pandemic response. And as Karen said, the next pandemic may not be COVID and it may not be influenza, but a lot of the guiding principles could still be there about information sharing and mobilization, as Ramy said, to create trials and to have responsive information. So I'd rather think that we control COVID, but we don't disband CanCOVID. We'll just have to rebrand it to be responsible to a broader mandate.
So that's Marcel's vision. How about you, Ramy? Do you have ideas for how this could move forward? Maybe a niche that's not currently being addressed by CanCOVID that could be really productive?
I'll start by saying I agree with everything Marcel said. I'll add two things. I think if I was sitting from the government side and looking at CanCOVID and what came out of it, I think they can target key areas from CanCOVID in order to create a pandemic response team. Every time there's a pandemic, there is this team with an already established infrastructure that can get up and running within a week, and then we're all ready to move forward and be very much prepared. What we learned from COVID is that we are not as prepared as we think we are, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And so if we can take some of the structures laid by the CanCOVID initiative, we'll be in a much better position for whatever the next virus or not virus might come into play. The second part is CanCOVID proved that even people in high positions in hospitals can sit down and talk to people in community and try to bond over certain issues. I think CanCOVID can become, as I said, CanTrials, what I called it in my presentation, or any type of channel where people can pitch ideas among each other in order to see how they can push the envelope of our healthcare system.
Excuse me, Karen, what would you add to this? What's your vision for CanCOVID in the future?
So I really appreciate the comments that Marcel and Ramy have put forward, and the idea of sort of maintaining this as, in some ways, surge capacity going forward, a network of not just experts, but interested parties. Perhaps it won't be CanCOVID, but Canada Infectious Disease, or all of the themes in CanCOVID could be translated to a broader sense that can be helpful as well. But certainly, I think those are both great examples. The other potential is trying something like this on another wicked problem. My last position was ADM of Science and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And clearly climate change is one of those really wicked problems where you'd like to harness more of the capacity and expertise to feed in to help solve problems. So I think there's both the CanCOVID and its legacy in terms of things like infectious disease, all of the issues we've seen on clinical trials, making improvements in clinical trials, I think is a clear win. But there is also, are there other areas where something like this would be helpful?
Thank you, Karen. We have 2 more questions that have come on. But I think we've run out of time. But we can answer those questions offline. We'll keep track of them and get back to you on that. There's one about contact tracing apps, which is absolutely on our radar, and we have prepared some briefing documents on that. So that's definitely something we've responded. The other thing that I would just like to say is that you heard my biography at the beginning of this, and you might think, why is she moderating this panel? Because what do I know about any of this? And the answer is nothing, essentially. But I come from a space background. I'm an astrophysicist. I have zero biomedical information. I do come from a background where I have a lot of experience with large collaborations. And as a department science advisor, I've just learned a ton from working with my colleagues, both within the space agency and also in government departments. And what I absolutely love about CanCOVID is the fantastic people that I have gotten to meet, such as Karen and Marcel and Ramy, who are so committed and so talented and have such fantastic ideas, and just how much that I have learned about Canada, about the just the depth of our scientific acumen and talent, and also the commitment to really work together to deal with this pandemic and to come out of this crisis. So it's been an incredibly enriching experience for me. And I'd like to very much thank our panelists who have been fantastic and have brought a lot of their insights to this pandemic. And thank you so much for listening. And now I'd like to pass back to Mehrdad Hariri for the sign off. So thank you again to our panelists and to you for our listeners, and to CSPC for hosting us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this very insightful panel. I want to thank panelists Sarah, Karen, Marcel, and Ramy for this very exciting discussion. And I look forward to continue the conversation about the project and about the lessons learned. I hope you continue your work and maintain the project. I have a name for you that can be called Can Pandemic. We can keep it and no royalty. And but certainly we would like to have you back to tell us about the lessons learned. I also want to thank the participants of this session, and I want to ask them if they don't mind to answer one question about how we performed. How do they like this panel? There is a poll will be launched by CSPC office, and I appreciate if you could respond to that. Meantime, I want to take the opportunity to announce the next panel, which will be on June 29th at noon Eastern Time. The panel with Dr. Imogen Ko from Ryerson University and Dr. Melinda Smith from University of Calgary. And the title of this conversation is Inclusive Excellence in Science Post-COVID-19, Matching Words with Actions. It would be a very interesting discussion, and you can follow us on our Twitter and other social media and register for this session. Once again, I want to thank everyone, the panelists, the participants, and wish you a very happy and safe and healthy day. Thank you.